Well, it's my fine friend Carolyn Landon, otherwise known as Lynn. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
Now, we're going to talk about the Kooris today, the Kurnai people.
Yep.
And unlike the Kurnai, you're actually a migrant to this country, correct?
Yes, I am a migrant to this country, as you can tell by my accent. Nobody can miss that. I was lucky enough to meet the Kurnai when young Daryl Mowburn, better known as Ralph, came into my Year 7 English class, and I got to know him, and through him I got to know his mother, and his mother asked me to help her father, Daryl Tonkin, to write the story of Jackson's Track. And so I was so privileged to be asked to do that. It was the biggest honor and the beginning of my education in this country. When Daryl came into my classroom, it was wonderful because I got to meet his mother, and then she started teaching me. She was my teacher.
His mother being Pauline Mullet.
Pauline Mullet, who you've seen in this series already. She's a wonderful, wonderful person.
Well, the plot thickens here because with Pauline was the beginning of your marvellous best-selling book, Jackson's Track, yes?
I wrote the book with Pauline's father, Daryl Tonkin. He told the stories, and I wrote them down, and every week I showed him what I'd written and asked him if I'd got it right, and he did say, well, I'll say one thing about you, you know how to tell a story, when actually it was Daryl who knew how to tell the story. And I shaped it for him so it became a bestseller. It was an extraordinary experience for me to meet that wonderful man. I used to go to his kitchen or his house at Jackson's Track, into his kitchen with the great fire, and it didn't matter what time I arrived, the billy was just on the boil, and he made me a cup of coffee. He had a special jar of coffee for me because nobody else that he knew in the world drank coffee but me. I would have been glad to drink the tea, but I was very impressed that he had coffee for me, and with goat's milk that he got from his own goats when we first started.
Really? He milked his own goats?
Milked his own goats, and gave me the milk in my coffee was goat milk. And it was great. It was great. Also, he always had the damper was just coming out of the camp oven on the fire as well. He was just the best host ever. And he was a great storyteller, and I was so lucky. It was Pauline who set that up for me to go and speak to him and help him to get the book written.
And that was a wonderful adventure for you that's still going, I suppose.
Well, it's still going. I will never forget what I learned, and I've since then written a book about Eileen Harrison, who's an artist. She comes from the Dimboola area, Wajabuluk country, but she lives in Warrigal. She's a connection, I suppose, because she's connected to Pauline's grandmother, Dora Hood, who was married to Stuart Hood. And they were the people who were the kind of elders at Jackson's Track. One of the greatest things that happened was after the book was published, and the people of Druin didn't really know the story about Jackson's Track, even though the people at Jackson's Track and Lionel Rose had lived at Jackson's Track for a good 25 years, or since the late 30s. When the book was published in 1999, the Druin people asked Pauline and I to come speak to the Australia Day breakfast. Now, this was a bit of a problem for Pauline because Australia Day isn't really something to celebrate for the Indigenous people, but she said, yeah, I'm going to stand there and I'm going to tell them a few things.
Well, that would have been a first for her, wouldn't it, to sort of stand up and speak like that in the town where she came from?
I thought it was a first for her, but boy, she was good at it. She was a natural if it was the first. Pauline knows how to speak her mind, as those of you who have ever met her know. But she was ready. She had things to say. I don't think she had ever spoken to a whitefella group before like this. These were the people who believed in the status quo. They were people who thought they knew what was what. And when Pauline stood up, and I spoke about the book, and then Pauline spoke about herself and her people. And she started saying that to the people in the audience, You think that we have lost everything. You think that we have no language. You think we have no culture. You think we don't know who we are, but we do. And then she started explaining things and telling stories. And the people in the audience were stunned, and they were overwhelmed by this articulate woman, strong woman, telling them how it was. And I was so proud of her. And when she finished, and we were finished speaking, there was a standing ovation for 10 minutes, and Pauline and I just stood there grinning and feeling silly because there was nothing for us to do but just stand there while they clapped. And this was the beginning of everything for me. They woke up. They didn't know anything about the people who had been living amongst them for 30 years. They hadn't paid any attention. They looked away from them, and suddenly they were hearing things they couldn't believe. And in fact, I was hearing things I couldn't believe. Pauline hadn't said these things before, but she had the courage. This book gave her the courage. And then as the book became more and more famous, and people started asking me questions about the family and about the Kurnai, I had to find out a lot of things. I suppose because Pauline talked about how much she knew and how much hadn't been lost, and that they knew their stories, I started becoming interested in what stories did they know. There's an interesting story told by Caroline Briggs, who's a Bunurong person. She's part of the Kulin Nation. Bunurong is part of the Kulin Nation. And she tells a story about Port Phillip Bay. She says that once, many, many years ago, and this is part of the Bunurong mythology, Melbourne itself, which was actually the central area where the Kulin people lived, or where they gathered each year, Melbourne itself actually went right down to the sea, and there was no bay. There was land where the kangaroo roamed and where they could hunt, and there was a great deal of food there for them, which is why they were there in the first place. But then the different clans, and Bunurong was one of the clans of the Kulin people, the Woiwurrung, Wiradjuri, several clans together, and way back, the Kurnai seemed to be, I understand, part of the Kulin people, but way back, more than 10,000 years ago, suddenly the waters began to rise, and it's about that time, from a white fellow point of view, that in geology we know that Australia began to take a different shape because the water began to rise, and Port Phillip Bay was formed, and so was Western Port. Before that, it had been a place for hunting. And the people, the myth, I don't know if it's a myth, it's a story that the Aboriginal people have told themselves for thousands of years about what happened, that the Kulin tribes were fighting with each other, and they started doing wrong things, and they started eating the food when they shouldn't, and fishing when they shouldn't, and killing animals and then not eating them, and just breaking the law. And that was the reason the water began to rise. Bunjil allowed the water to rise. So the people became very upset because their land was disappearing. So they asked Bunjil, the ancestor for down here, they asked him to please stop the water. And he said, "You've got to start acting properly." And he started giving them lessons. And so they learned how to get along in the world as we know it now. The interesting thing about this is that this really did happen, that this story is actually true. It's told in spiritual terms. It's told as a legend, but it's told so that the story will be remembered down the millennia, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so when Pauline said, "I know the history of me and my people," I realized that she knew things about ancient history that we hadn't even dreamed of yet. The stories are true that they tell us.
Yeah, it's very exciting, isn't it? And as you say, what the legends or myths actually contain deep truths.
Absolutely. And so, I've become very good friends with Pauline. She's just a treasure, that woman. And she and I went, as Jackson's Trap became more and more famous, she and I would go off away from Gippsland, and we would go off and talk to different groups. And as soon as we started to move off country, she knew that she was no longer at home. And she started looking around, and she started behaving slightly differently, because from ancient times, the law was that you didn't go from one country to the next as an indigenous person unless you were invited, or you had certain permissions, or you went through certain protocols. And in Pauline's soul, she knew this. And when I talked to her about history and, things being really old, and she realizes I'm talking about things that began in 1788 and sovereignty, and that really old here to us is only 250 years, she just thinks that's so funny, because in fact she thinks in 40,000 years or 10,000 years. That's something that I've heard since many, many times as I was realizing with Pauline, is that for Koris to get together, not just the Kurnai, but any indigenous person, when they get together, they know that the people they're speaking to understand ancient history and ancient truths that we're only just learning about.
How good's that? And now I like the fact that all those Kulin, all those different tribes would gather, as you mentioned to me before, the site of the current site of the Parliament House down there, and this was the big powwow corroborees that they used to have, and the Kurnai and all those other people would go there and nut stuff out.
I know, isn't that just that's so cool? And Flagstaff Gardens was another place. The Kulin as a nation, they were a very large and strong nation. They reckon that before Whitefella came here with our diseases and our greed, I suppose, and that we took the land from them, and the Aboriginal people began to die of all sorts of problems, massacre among them. They reckon there may have been as many as 300,000 people in the southeast corner of Australia. When they started counting them in the 1930s, they could only find 11,000, which tells you that a huge change took place after 1788 in this country. But before we came here and started to change things, and in fact we didn't start changing things here in Victoria until the 1830s, the Kulin was a big, healthy, proud nation, and they gathered together in Melbourne every year, and probably at the right time of year, to catch certain foodstuffs and to harvest, and also to have huge ritualistic ceremonies and play games like Australian rules football, which they invented.
Got to have a bit of fun.
And, all sorts of competitions, games, ritual, and the meeting place for all the elders of the different clans was on the hill where Parliament House is now. One of the clans would meet at Flagstaff Gardens. Another of the clans met where the MCG is now, in the Melbourne Gardens as well. And you can just imagine what it might have been like before it was cleared, but it was cleared because they did have husbandry then. They cleared it so that the land would be a land of plenty for them. And the Kurnai people, I understand. Now, this is a Whitefella view. I think of things in terms of history. They think in terms of, there's no time passing. It's then is now, and the future is now. Kurnai, apparently, their group, their clan, was mostly settled in Gippsland. And it was after the flood, which is part of the myth that I just told you, the Kurnai then found themselves locked more in Gippsland than they had been, and so the Kurnai became the Gippslanders.
So when Bunjil did his thing and sorted all the problems out, the Kurnai found themselves landlocked.
Yeah, the Kurnai were separated off by the swamp, the large swamp that went as far as Kuirup, as far as Bunyip, actually. And Kurnai country actually begins at the Bunyip River. It goes up to the Bawbaws. It goes right across all of Gippsland. And then it comes back on the coast, along the lakes. It comes back to Wilson's Prom. And the Wilson's Prom is mostly owned by the Kurnai, or they claim it. And then they share part of Wilson's Prom, and I'm not exactly sure which part, with the Bunurong, and the Bunurong then take over the coastal part of Victoria from there. And so the Kurnai share a boundary with the Bunurong. Now that brings us to the fact that Victoria was divided into many different tribal groups, each group responsible for different parts of the country, which was made up Victoria. Kulin had their group, the Kurnai had theirs, and then there were other groups that were near Warrnambool and other groups up near Dimboola, and they each had their own country with their own myths, their own stories, their own languages. The languages overlapped, but and sometimes the stories overlapped as well, but they were separate, and it was very important for the different tribes to know their law so that they knew where they belonged.
Well, I can feel a problem coming on here, because when the big roundup started happening, all hell's going to break loose.
Well, as I said, by 1834, 1840, there were very few Aboriginal people left, at least that the whitefella could find and record, and they decided at first to make mission stations of Framlingham, Ebenezer, Corandurk, Ramayak, Lake Tyers, and a couple of others like Conda.
Now, Ramayak's up near our Lake Tyers, isn't it?
Ramayak is up at Lake Wellington, part of the lakes. But then it became too expensive, and they decided they wanted to move everyone to Lake Tyers. Between 1904 and 1920, they moved everyone that they could find to Lake Tyers, and this created a mishmash of people. But once the people came off their own country, the protocol was that when you went into another person's country and went into a country that wasn't your own, the protocol was that you didn't sing your songs or do your ritual or speak your language in a country that wasn't your own.
Well, here's our first stolen generation.
I suppose, because when they were shifted to Lake Tyers, suddenly their stories began to disappear, the stories that came from everywhere except Gippsland. The Kurnai, on the other hand, they belonged here, so that when they were shifted to Lake Tyers, they could remember their rituals, and they could tell their children their rituals and their stories and around the campfire. And it started to become that everybody began to learn the Kurnai stories and forget their own stories from the past. And this has created a huge confusion.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, who is who? Who was from somewhere and who's from here? The Kurnai people, they know who they are. They are from Gippsland. They are the first people of Gippsland. That's what I think, and I love them.
I do too.
In order to identify themselves and declare who they are, to know who their ancestors are. But in terms of our law, the white fellas, we only will believe what's in the record. Whereas I believe these people, the Kurnai, know much more than is in the record. In terms of law, we don't believe them. And so the ancestor that can be identified by both the Kurnai and the whitefellas is Kitty Perry. She is the Kurnai ancestor who is identifiable in the record. And the Kurnai people, the people who call themselves Kurnai here, they can trace themselves back to Kitty. Now, she's only the great-great-grandmother of Pauline.
That's pretty close, isn't it?
Pretty close, but that tells you how recent whitefella history is when we know that it's at least 10,000 years here in Gippsland, much older than that, actually. And so it's very frustrating for the Indigenous people to try to explain who they are. Okay, Kitty was married to Larry Johnson. They had a daughter, Helen, who lived at Ramayak. Colin Hood is the other ancestor, but he comes from Warrnambool. He comes from off Framlingham. And when he was a young man, he was a political man, and he became a friend with Alfred Deakin, who was very important in this state. Deakin had some sympathy for the Aboriginal people who were doing it hard. He could see it. And so he actually allowed the people from Warrnambool to claim or lease land. They were given leases. And Colin Hood had 40 acres where he brought up his family, a wife and children, about the 1880s. They had good land, and the whitefellas wanted it, and so they took it. Colin lost his family. They all died. He then was so dismayed and felt so betrayed that he turned his back on his own country and he walked across the entire state to Ramayak at Lake Wellington. And there he met Helen Johnson, who was Kitty Perry's and Larry Johnson's daughter, and he married her. And once he married a true Kurnai, he had to give away his own country. So he learned the Kurnai way, he learned the Kurnai myths and stories, he learned the Kurnai language, and he learned the Kurnai law. He became a Kurnai. And so this is where, Pauline, this is where the Kurnai people that you've been talking to, this is who they come from. The Roses also came from Warrnambool Way. They didn't walk, they were brought, but they married into the Kurnai group. So the Roses are connected to the Hoods, and Ma Hood became a Kurnai because Stuart Hood, the father at Jackson's Track, married Dora Harrison, who was brought over from Dimboola because he could marry her because the genes were right. There were so many of the Kurnai, just like everywhere else, so many had died that the old laws of marriage and kinship had disintegrated. So when they brought the new people over from different country and they came to Kurnai country, then they had people to marry.
How fantastic.
Interesting, isn't it?
I love it.
Now, I'm telling this from a white person's point of view. The Kurnai I know can tell it much better.
And now Jackson's Track is its own very fine piece of history as well. That is the Jackson's Track you've written about.
Yeah, Jackson's Track is more of a modern history from what I've just said. And it's told in Daryl Tonkin's point of view. It's told in his voice. He tells the story about his own life and how he became enmeshed with the Kurnai people. And he married Yuffie. He had 8, 9, 10 kids. He lived in the forest in Druin. It became a large camp of 150, not all Kurnai, people from everywhere, and they worked with him felling trees. He is a strong, wonderful, beautiful man who took another culture into his heart, and he became the father of these people. If it weren't for him, I don't know if I ever would have learned this, but I'll tell you what, the story he told is the most important story I've ever learned.
Fantastic. How good's that? Thank you very, very much. I've really enjoyed this and I've learned a lot of things.
Good. Well, so have I, and we'll keep on learning. We need to keep on learning this story.